Good evening and welcome to Tuesday Night Live. Lovely to have you join us. We have some folk here in the studio with us. If you want to put your hands together, that would be awesome. And of course, people engaging with us around Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, and of course, other countries as well. If you're with us for the first time, a warm welcome to you. It's easy to engage. You can add your comments and questions to the comments thread either on Facebook or YouTube anytime throughout the hour. And if you're watching on demand during the week, welcome to you as well. And you can contact me anytime, either by Facebook Messenger with comments or questions, or email connect@baysidechurch.com.au. Well, this is a very special time that we have together right now. This is the 100th episode of the Digging Deeper podcast. And we wanted to do something different. And so I thought, why not invite two of my favorite humans to engage in some questions and discussion with us over the next hour or so. And they just happen to be from America. So Shane Willard is from the South, and Tal actually tells me he's not from America, he's from New Jersey. But of course, you're from the north, and so a warm welcome both to Tal and to Shane as well. And we've got some questions and comments. In fact, I asked Shane what he would like to discuss with Tal, and then I asked Tal what he would like to discuss with Shane. And so they've given me some comments, some topics, some questions. And we'll start with one of Shane's, and that is this. From the story of Genesis 18, where Abraham hurries to the three strangers to show hospitality. And Shane says, this could be discussed from his perspective, from Tal's perspective. I see hospitality as a stewarding of the call to bless the world, starting with the three in front of you. And that is me, Shane, and Tal. So, Tal, what's your comments to the story of hospitality in Genesis 18?
Well, obviously, Abraham went to a really good TAFE and discovered how to do hospitality. It's a core belief. I mean, there are some things that that you should understand in terms of context. Legend has it. So the Midrash, the legend, not the black letter Torah, but the legend has it that that Abraham and Sarah had two separate tents. They were very continental in that way. They lived in two separate tents, and Sarah's tent always smelled of baking bread, all right? And, you know, it's like if you're passing by a Glick's bakery and they have the fans from the back blowing the smell of baking bread out onto the street. So you just, even before you think about it, you go, and you follow it in, right? It's a very welcoming smell. Abraham, on the other hand, had a tent that had no walls. Very, how do you say, open...
Open plan?
Open plan, a very open plan. The original open plan, 3,500 years before its time. And so he can welcome people from all directions. Now, the thing you got to understand about this specific instance was that he saw three strangers walking across the desert. But what was he in the middle of? Because everything is context within the Torah. He was conversing with God. He was conversing with God in the text. And he was nursing himself. He was trying to heal himself. And what was he healing himself from? He had just performed a brit on himself. He had just given himself the first ritual circumcision, right? Talk about bulk billing, right? He gave his first circumcision, and he was healing himself. He's talking to God at the entrance of his tent, which is kind of a play on words because there is no entrance, because it's all entrance, correct? And he sees these three strangers. I want you to imagine you're in the middle of the desert. How many of you raise your hands? You see, I haven't answered the question yet. How many of you have been on a hot day at a beach and you step off the towel with your bare feet and you go on the sand. It hurts, right? All right? We're in the middle of the desert. Abraham sees these strangers passing by. And what does he do? He turns away from God because welcoming the strangers in the Jewish tradition is more important than him talking with God.
Wow.
They're welcoming those strangers. And what does he do? He runs out to meet them. And what's the first thing he does? We're a very tactile people. He pours cold water on their feet. What a beautiful image, because you can feel it. You can feel how your feet, after you run across the hot sand and you take a deep, you put your feet in the bay, in the ocean, how good does that feel? That's a literal, very visceral, physical feeling. And then he invites them in. And in quick succession, he says, can you please stay? Because he doesn't know that they're malachim. They're messengers of God. He does not know that they're angels. They're just strangers. And he gets Sarah, who's in the other tent, and some other people to prepare a meal because, after all, they're Hebrews, so they got to eat when they're welcoming guests. And they eat. And after this dinner, Sarah goes to her tent. The three strangers, you can just imagine, three strangers and Abraham with a glass of sherry after the meal and lighting up some cigars in the desert. Who knows what they did. But the guests say, this time next year when the season is right, you will have a son with Sarah. Now, Sarah overhears that in the tent. I'm going to try to make this short. I know it's too late. Sarah's in the tent, and Sarah laughs. And this is where the Jewish tradition tries to leave the ambiguity and tries to stir things up and starts to say, why did Sarah laugh? Sarah could have laughed because she was happy. Sarah could have laughed because she couldn't believe what was happening, because she was an old woman by then. Or we also believe that Sarah could have laughed because she was bitterly angry with God, because they had been promised this for a very long time. And is this yet another promise that is going to be broken? So it leaves the door open to a very complicated relationship with God and a very, I'll say not simplistic, but straightforward relationship of how we should be with strangers. That we should go the extra mile to welcome them in, and we should do it in more than words. We should make them feel physically healed and welcome within the community. Does that come close to
that's beautiful.
Answering the question, Shane?
Beautiful. And I'll go to Shane in just a moment, but I love the rest of that chapter. I think it's really, really funny because it's the next few verses are that conversation about Sarah laughing, as you said, and the confrontation of Sarah, you laughed. No, I didn't, she says. Yes, you did. And that's basically the rest of the chapter. Anyway.
But one last thing, because that's very important.
Okay.
It's a secondary. The original conversation is between Abraham and God. And God is saying, why, when Sarah laughs, Sarah says, how can I have a child now that I and my husband are so old? Right? Very straightforward. God confronts Abraham and says, why does Sarah say that she cannot have a child? Because she is too old. And what the rabbi said is God is not telling Abraham the complete truth because it would cause strife within the household that Sarah was saying that he's not old, that he's old, too old to have a kid. And what God wants to do is just allow the home life of Sarah and Abraham to continue as peacefully as possible. Because shalom bayit, peace in the home, is very, very much a foundation in the tradition.
Stunning. Shane?
Yeah, that was excuse me, that was brilliant. I'm gonna think about that in Hebrew thought, how you treat the stranger actually took precedent over your conversation with God. It really confronts the hyper spirituality of I don't have time for you because I'm praying for 5 hours or something like that. It also I love the observation around how long it was taking for the promise to come. Like God promised Abraham this stuff way back, and then it was really not going well. They end up in Egypt. They end up in a famine. They end up in the middle of a civil war. And one of the things I saw in the passage was that the promise way back when was taking so long to come to pass. But it's when he refused to label these people. He that labels are for products, love is for people. And when he refused to label them, he refused to investigate what they could bring to the table. He didn't ask, "Do you agree with me?" He didn't even ask, "Do you worship the same God as me?" He just saw people and decided, I'm gonna I'm gonna unlock all of my family's hospitality potential towards these three strangers without knowing they were messengers of God. And it's then that there was a clear sort of, hey, this is when the promise is going to start to take place. Sarah laughs, and but the way I started thinking about it was if the call was to be a blessing to the whole world, how could you ever expect to be a blessing to the whole world if you can't be a blessing to the three people standing in front of you? There was a friend of mine sent me a cartoon that I thought, normally I think those things are boring, but this was quite thought provoking. It was two stick figures basically carrying a banner with on a pole on each side with a banner in the middle that said, "Make our nation Christian again." And there's this posture of chanting, "Make our nation Christian again," and yet they were stepping over the beggars and the homeless and the marginalized. And so in their own pursuit of God, they forgot the people God cares about, namely people.
Yeah, and there's a very certain agenda that would be in the minds of people who would be posting something like that, and I dare say it wouldn't look an awful lot like Jesus from what I have seen of that whole rhetoric. Hey, Shane, I want to throw this one to you. This one is from Tal, and his premise is Jesus took human form to live a human life, and his question is why?
Well, with respect to our time constraints and the trite ability that I could have to encapsulate something so beautiful, in the Christian tradition, it was really important early on that people acknowledge the humanity of Jesus, that he came in flesh. And one of the things around that I find particularly challenging and beautiful is the gap between acceptance and understanding. That when you remove understanding from acceptance, it taints the acceptance. So, for instance, if you were to have a conversation with your spouse and you go, "Look, I'm tired of this. I just want you to know I fully accept whatever you're saying. I just don't understand a word of it." Right? Well, when you remove that understanding from your stated acceptance, it does something to the acceptance. It's Tal would be familiar with this as well, coming from New Jersey, me coming from the South. Racism in America. This is one of the issues um, with racism in America is not overt racists, although they certainly are there and it's abhorrent. It's more people like me who were not racist. I fully accepted people of color, but I realized probably 5 years ago, 2018, 2019, that although I fully accepted African Americans, I had not taken the appropriate time to understand their story. And so I spent 3 or 4 years just looking at their stories and trying to understand what it was like to be African American in America, and particularly in the American South. And then I started doing like informal surveys, like, when I say informal, I just asked people who I knew weren't racist, but I just would say things like, what happened in your heart with what happened to Emmett Till, Walter McMillan, the Jim Crow laws, the exception clause to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the privatization of prisons, the mandatory minimum sentencing for, say, crack, and how that just produced an incredible amount of slave labor for private corporations. And like these good-hearted, educated, kind people were going, Emmett Till, I know I should know this, and it rings a bell, but and so when we removed understanding from acceptance, it taints it. I think that's part of the story of the incarnation, is that accepting humanity was only part of the goal. But to understand humanity along with the acceptance actually is an important part of adding value to the acceptance. That's a 4-minute version of that I find pretty beautiful, that God doesn't just accept me, although I'm so thankful for that, despite all my flaws and weaknesses, but actually he understands the weaknesses.
May I?
Yeah, please do.
That's absolutely wonderful. I'm just as I will put a little curveball on that, and that's a spinner for you cricket people. A curveball to that, and make it possibly more complex by just saying that one part of my work is I'm autistic. And part of my work is inclusion for people who are neurodiverse. That's my full-time gig. And one of our core values within this inclusion movement is that understanding is not a prerequisite to acceptance. So in other words, I'm not negating what you said, but but what I mean is that there's a level of acceptance, because as neurodiverse people, we have this understanding that no one is going to completely understand what our lives are like. In the same way, as I'm sure Shane will agree with me, that no matter how much we can become educated or we become empathetic for people of color in the States, we cannot completely understand what it's like to live in that situation. We can be sympathetic and empathetic, but the complete understanding is not there. The acceptance part initially is that so many people are saying, well, I don't understand why you do that, why you're gay, why you're neurodiverse, why you do your lifestyle. And they say, if we can't understand you, that's going to be an impediment for us to accept your humanity. Where it should be a 3-tier cycle where you accept people as being, all people, as being created in the image of God, because that's what we believe, that's in text, right? Created in the image of God, and because of that, everyone has a spark of sacredness within them, and we accept them as human beings. And that's the starting point of having that wonderful, incredible human skill and yearning called curiosity. And we become curious of this other human being, and through that curiosity, we have a healthy process of beginning to understand how they walk their path in life, and then we have a renewed, fuller acceptance about who they are as a human being. So I just wanted to throw in a little bit of complexity, extra complexity from and also to expand how you were very economical in that that dialogue there.
Yeah, I can't
That's
agree
beautiful.
more. I can't agree more. That was so beautiful, Tal. That acceptance comes first, and understanding isn't necessary for the acceptance. Because if you do it in reverse, you could start to dehumanize people you don't understand, and then we label them as the other, and we can justify mistreating them. I think of, and like this isn't this is just coming off the top of my head, but it's in the Hebrew wisdom scriptures. It's a book called Lamentations, which my understanding is, and I fully surrender if I got this wrong. My understanding is that the word lament in Hebrew is howl. Like, so in the wisdom tradition, you don't engage suffering by trying to intellectualize it with why. You help people find their expression of how. And there's this interesting thing, for people who don't know, this is my understanding of it. There's 5 poems with 3 characters: a narrator, a woman who is the humanization of the city that's been decimated, and the man that is the humanization of the priestly system where the temple got destroyed. And the narrator's kind of emotionless. He's just a fat teller, and he's like, "Look, you deserve the destruction. You did it. Where are your lovers now? They said they'd be with you. They're not here. Like, you trusted the wrong people." And then he says something like in English, like, "Don't act like you didn't commit adultery. Your uncleanness is up your skirt." I'm not sure what the actual Hebrew is there, but that sounds serious. And then she speaks up, and for a whole chapter, doesn't ask for advice, doesn't engage in any way other than to say, "Hey, look at my pain, look at my distress, look at my despair, look at my plight. Yeah, you got a point. I probably deserved it, but seriously, like, look at this." And after a whole chapter of that, in Lamentations 2:13, the narrator comes back and says, "Oh, your suffering is as vast as the sea. How can I restore comfort to you, O virgin daughter?" So, in one chapter of just engaging with empathy, an attempt to understand, he changed his tone from "your uncleanness is up your skirt" to "how can I restore comfort to you, O virgin daughter?" And I think that's an important an important aspect to how the Jewish faith changed the world by saying all people, whether you understand them or not, have inherent value, a divine spark. And because in the Roman Empire, as you both would know, murder was legal as long as they were lower class than you. Rape legal as long as they were lower class than you. Full birth abortion was like a normal, natural part of economics. Pedophilia legal as long as they were lower class than you. Bestiality was legal as a public act of worship to the goat god Pan in Caesarea Philippi. So the Jewish faith, and then the Christian faith again, the part of how they changed the world was to say, "Wait a minute, hold on, whoa. You can't treat people in the tiers you've got them set up in, without acknowledging and accepting the divine spark in all people." It made the world a better place.
That's a beautiful, beautiful picture. I love that. Hey, there's a part B to Tal's question that I'm going to ask you now, Shane,
Okay.
because part A is never enough for Tal.
You got to go back for seconds.
In the black letter text, when did Jesus experience regret, guilt, embarrassment, or getting it wrong? Did he ever have to apologize for his actions, and did he do teshuvah?
And you're familiar with teshuvah, or?
Yeah, it's repentance. It's my understanding, to change course or turn around.
It's the turnaround. It's a process where you apologize, apology is accepted or not, and then you have to change your actions afterwards.
Sure. So, look, I think, in terms of Jesus having regret, I'm not sure. Embarrassment, I'm sure. Look, if he lived a normal life, I think it's reasonable to assume that, given his values as evinced in the Sermon on the Mount, if there wasn't this giant gap between what he was preaching and how he was living, I think that it's reasonable to assume that there was times where, just by nature of considering the other person as having more value than himself, which is what he called us to do, that he likely took the higher road at times. I think of a few times in his life where he would have been confronted with like certain things that the scriptures say, like there's like 7 or 8 different times where Sidonians are identified as enemies of God. And then he has this encounter with this Sidonian woman, and there's all this tension in the passage around who's allowed at the table, who's not allowed at the table. and he ends up acquiescing to her wish, despite the people he was sitting with probably wouldn't have been okay with that. And so I think there's a real humanness to it. You definitely see in the black letters grief, like pain from a friend dying. But you definitely see things like fighting with God. I don't know if that's the right word. And in a world where people just pick apart every word you say, I'm trying to be careful, but I'm thinking about like the agony of the garden, where there's something in him that doesn't want to go through with this, and he's like, is there any way? There's this wrestle with God in that moment, and so you see little things like that, or little things. So you see some things like that that go, man, like Jesus. Jesus was a human being, and I think that's important to remember, because if in the Christian tradition, if we only think of Jesus as God, it becomes very easy to rationalize not living how he taught us to live. It's like, come on, hey, Jesus taught us to treat our enemies better than that. You're like, I know, but that's easy for him. He was God, Yeah, but he was also okay. He was also a human being, and so the Christian mistake often is to forget the humanity of Jesus and only think of Jesus in terms of divinity. And I think that has its own errors as well.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that it was implied in how you were trying to dance around the fighting with God, that
Mhm.
that concept would be controversial, where it is at core in the Hebraic, fighting with God. Who else would you fight with? It's like, fight with my wife. My wife? I love my wife. Yeah, but who would you fight with? Of course you're going to fight with. Who else are you going to fight with but your wife, right? The person that's near, that you have more interactions with. And if you are going to, I feel like I'm preaching. Well, I'm in the right place.
You are.
If you are going to have a full relation with anyone, you're going to get down. I'll keep it clean. Down. I'm from Jersey, but I'll still keep the language clean. You'll still get really, really angry with them. And it's such a core value about fighting with God and wrestling with God and striving with and against God, that is literally what Yisrael translates as.
Hmm.
One who will wrestle with God. That's our entire people. Our name we are basically God's PITA. You know what PITA is, right? PITA, pain in the ass, right? So we are God's, we have a full relationship. And I would encourage, because God's a big being.
Yep.
God can survive anger. In the Jewish tradition, God can survive and be appreciative of anger and joy and praise and a little bit of condemnation. The one thing God does not really appreciate is indifference, because indifference is the major downfall.
Yeah, stunning. You think about the Psalms. I mean, the Psalms are full of people questioning God, blaming God, being angry with God, and it's all in the inspired text. And so God has to be okay with all of those expressions. Hey, for time's sake, I want to move on to Shane's second topic for you, Tal, and I want to see you guys or hear you guys interact with this. This is the Babel story, Genesis 11. Describes what our lives look like when we surround ourselves with people who say the same things as us. We end up building a tower to protect our things instead of a table to invite the world. Shane, would you like to talk into that first? And then I'm going to get Tal to interact with you.
Sure. So I just was looking at that story and trying to have fresh eyes around it. And I remember this wasn't even too long ago, a great person who meant well, they were speaking at this thing, and they used this phrase from the Bible story. if with one heart and one mind they can do this, then nothing they do would be impossible. And the way he was applying it was that unity and agreement means there's limitless things for our faith. And I just happened to have the scripture open, and I just kept reading just for whatever reason, and I realized, oh, that was kind of the thing the Lord wasn't happy about. So he actually corrects that. And so I started thinking, well, what does that have to do with me? And more particularly, what does that have to do with the present world? So on a big story, like I think one of the issues, particularly in America, is Babel. It's the necessary polarization to only listen to people who look like you, sound like you, speak the same language you, and agree with you. And in my own journey, that's been an overemphasis from others, because Rob would know that, I speak for everybody. I've done some Baptist stuff, some Assemblies of God stuff, independent stuff, Anglican stuff. I've spoke for the Catholics. I've done a big conference for the Seventh-day Adventist. And every now and then that bothers people, and they'll, particularly when I did the Seventh-day Adventist event, I had some people were like, "Do you agree with them?" And I remember just thinking, I never even considered once if I agreed with them. They're nice people. What's there to disagree with? And they were like, "Well, they worship on Saturday." And I'm like, "Yeah, but that's not the most dangerous thing. The most dangerous thing about them is that they're vegans."
It's outrageous.
Like,
Saturday, who does that? I don't know.
right, exactly. And I'm thinking, I thought, my goodness, like, I ate a brownie made of vegetables, and you're worried about what it, and Rob, try it. Eat something that big around that has 70 grams of fiber in it, right? Watch what, like, and then get up on a stage,
And then
right?
go and preach.
Right.
Have you had a matzo ball?
Probably. So my point was is that is when I started looking at this passage with fresher eyes, I started thinking, man, where have I bought into Babel, where everything on social media feeds, every bit of news feed is algorithm to tell me what I already want to hear. And so people then get into only listening to people who agree with them. And then when they do that, instead of building a table to show hospitality and generosity and compassion to the whole world, we end up building a tower to protect our agenda. And I'll just pass that on to you now to see what you think about that.
Facebook.
Right.
I mean, it is the, listen, the more you look at advertisement, the more you look at the Tanakh, the Old Testament, with fresh eyes. And when I say that, when I do text study or Bible study with students, no matter how old, young or old or anything like that, I tell them, I want you to get a Bible without any commentaries. No commentaries. All right? And if you're not going to do it in the original Hebrew, then get several of them. Because remember, every translation is a commentary, right? But it's amazing about how much incredible modern lessons are in it. Forward thinking, even to the fact of the creation story sequentially is evolution. Sequentially, it's going from very singularity type of life to more complex type of life and stuff like that. It's very, very scientific. And the Babel story, whereas, there's this, the common, is that, they all lived in harmony. First of all, they didn't say harmony. It's same language, all right? That's not the same as harmony. Harmony is where you have complementary different voices. This is like as one voice, They all had the same idea. They all did this, they all did that. The only place you have, like, elections in so-called democracy, where you have 95% of the population all voting for the same person, are in dictatorships, right? And basically what the people in Babel were doing, if you want a somewhat distant distanced. So we're not going to talk about today because, there are things that are highly charged today. But, it's triumph for the will. It's triumph for the will. We're talking about Nazi Germany. All right, we're talking, we can do anything if we all pull together one voice. We're going to eliminate all the voices that contradict us. The end game is that we want to have one voice, all right? Because we want, in fact, to build ourselves so high up to the heavens that we become our own idols. And we'll be able to worship and we won't be dependent on anything. And that is why that it all topples down. And there's a bit of chaos, and everyone goes back to speaking different languages. And there is a point after that, after the original fall down, that no one can understand each other. Because you know what? Dialoguing and conversation and understanding and acceptance and going to understanding and getting a deeper understanding of other people that do not necessarily agree with you and having compassion with them, you have to go through rehab to do that. Because that is a skill that if you don't use it, it becomes out of practice and you don't know how to communicate with other people. And that's why today is such a frightening time. Because it's going to get worse before it gets better. Because even if people realize we got to break out of this being in our own bubbles, there's going to be a time that we're going to have to rehab all the skills that we've learned in terms of understanding each other.
Shane, do you want to comment about that?
That is just so great. And I as an example, the one of the reasons it's so scary is there's this unspoken pressure to be known for our opinions about everything, and then it gets filtered. All the relationships then get filtered through who agrees. And so, as an example, and I'm online right now with a pastor from Melbourne and a rabbi who lives in Melbourne who's from Jersey, and Tal, you'll understand this big time because of your American past. So one of my best friends is from Texas, and a pastor from Australia rang me and said, "Hey, are you good friends with this guy?" And I said, "Yes, very good." And he said, "I'm thinking about having him in to speak." And I said, "Well, you should. He's good, you know." And he said, "But before I do, I need to know, like, is he one of these left people?" And there you go. So we're going to label him left, and then now he's the enemy. And so I confronted it just by saying, and this is a good friend of mine in Dallas and the guy in Australia. So I had the right to speak bluntly. I said, "Man, you're left." He said, "I most certainly am not left." I said, "You for sure are left." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I just got two questions. One, do you think every 18-year-old on earth should be able to go to Dick's Sporting Goods and buy a semi-automatic rifle?" He said, "No, that's dumb." I said, "Then you're left." I said, "Do you think everybody should pay their own, health care even if it breaks them? Or do you think there should be like a social safety net to make sure no one gets broke if they get sick?" And he goes, "No, you got to have social safety net and healthcare." I'm like, "Right." Then in Texas, you're a Democrat. So if you just make a sign, less guns, more healthcare, free healthcare, fly to Dallas from Sydney, and then get off at Dallas Fort Worth International Airport with a sign, less guns, free healthcare, and see how you go. In Dallas, Texas, he's maybe a little left, but you're way left in Dallas, Texas. And in Norway, you're a bit right. But why the need to be so known for every bit of minutia that we can label people as anything other than someone that God's at work in?
I love that. I love that. Thanks so much for that, Shane. That's gold. Hey, I'm going to get into Tal's second question for you. It's a two-part question and answer. Again, like this tells you something about Tal. Everything has to have, several parts, etc. And he wants you to answer this first as the leader of a Christian organization, and then secondly as Shane the person. So the question is: belief in any specific religious tradition the path to righteousness and redemption?
So I appreciate the way he framed the question because I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind the tension between our personal freedom and corporate tolerance, right? So if you ever mistake your own personal freedom arc with the thing you're leading, the arc it can tolerate, you can topple the whole organization in the name of your own personal conviction. And so I think that's a wise way to frame it. Now, in this case it just so happens that for me, the answer is the same. Let's talk about it in a couple ways. For a Christian, for someone in the Christian tradition, we would have a conviction that the final and full way to pursue God is found in the person of Christ. However, we would also clearly give space for Christ to be at work in people that haven't named him. So, as an example, Cornelius in Acts 10 was declared righteous by God because his generosity to the poor went up as a remembrance to God. And so here's a guy that maybe had never even heard of Jesus until Peter told him, but Peter said, God already counted you righteous. And then, of course, the obvious one is in Acts 17, where Paul shows up at the Areopagus and there's idols everywhere. And one of them didn't have a name. And he says, it just said to an unknown God. And Paul proclaims that to be Jesus. And he's talking to surely would have been almost 100% unchristian audience, or 100% people, almost 100% people who had never even heard of Jesus. This is in Athens, for goodness sake. And he proclaims an affirmation that Christ is at work in them, not far from any of them, that in him we live and move and have our being, that he calls them children of God. So in one sense, we would live with a conviction that the fullest way to pursue God is found in the person of Jesus, but we would also give space that Jesus is at, or the Spirit of God is at work in people who might not be able to name him yet. I guess a way to say it is some people know it in their heart, they just can't name it yet. Like I think of Sean Penn, who was Madonna's ex-husband, and 8 years ago he sold everything he owned in Beverly Hills, moved to Haiti, and gave it to the poor. And when they asked him, "Why'd you do that?" he said, "Oh, I can't name it, but there was an internal hum in my heart urging me to live for the betterment of others, and I knew I had to say yes." So there are people who know it, but they just can't name it. And maybe more dangerously is the other side of that. And I think this is a ditch for Christians to avoid. And that is, just because someone names it doesn't mean their life knows it. I saw a meme the other day where somebody was quoted, and I want to be fair, I don't know the person, and I don't know whether the quote was appropriate. I don't know if they were properly quoted, but so I'm not indicting the person who said it. I'm just talking about the actual words on the screen was something to the effect of, you can't preach the gospel simply by living it. You got to say the words with your mouth. And I'm thinking, hold on a second. So my great grandfather was illiterate. I'm not mad at him. No one taught him to read. He was a moonshiner. If you don't know what that is, that's running illegal liquor across state lines. It has nothing to do with showing your bum, right? He was in the Ku
Well,
Klux Klan.
sometimes it might lead to that, but
Yes, very well said. Like, you drink enough of it. He was in the Ku Klux Klan. He was on the board of directors at the church. His full faith was in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross to forgive his sins, which evidently were plentiful. Um, he um, he he died in heart surgery. He lived in a city that in 1950, 90% of people went to church. But in 1950, the policy was African Americans could not go to white dentists, so they had to go to the vets to get their teeth fixed. And so think about what that had to happen. The Christian white dentists got with the Christian city council, who got with the Christian city pastors, who made policies that made black people go to animal doctors to get their teeth fixed. So some people know it, they just can't name it. And more dangerously, some people name it too loud. but when you look at their life, they don't know it. So I think about Jesus when he said it this way, beware of people who wear their tassels too long. In a world where it was a multicultural world that had been conquered and taken over, and a Jewish person's tassels was like was part of their wardrobe that was commanded in Numbers 15, that basically identified them for what they believed and how they were living. And Jesus is like, beware of people who are too loud about what they believe and not loud enough about the demonstration of love to their world. Or let's put it in today's world. Beware of people whose fish on the car is too big. Beware of people whose cross around their neck is too big. Beware of people whose Christian T-shirt is a little bit too obnoxious. Beware of people who claim that the gift on their life is bigger than yours. Beware of people like that. Beware of people who'd rather be known for what they believe instead of how they're living. Beware of people like that. And so, to Tal's question, I think the fullest way to understand God is found in Christ. However, I see evidence in Scripture and in experience where Christ is at work in all people, and some of them haven't been able to name it yet, but that doesn't negate his work in them, nor does it negate every response they made to him in the middle of that process.
Great answer. Tal, you got a few things you'd like to say before I ask part B of your question?
Sorry. I can't even remember what part B is at this point, which is both frightening and comforting somehow at the same time. It's because it is problematic in terms of theologically speaking, because coming from, well, two things. One, although you soften the distance between creed and deed, because that's what you're talking about, the creed versus deed emphasis. The what do you believe in but how it fits with the articulation of that belief in real world time. All right. And whereas there are issues in terms of movements which are proselytizing and movements that aren't proselytizing, and movements that are big in number and movements that are small in number. I mean, Judaism is a very tribal religion. It's a peoplehood as opposed to just a religion. And we're very focused on deed versus creed. In other words, there are Jews that we consider incredibly righteous people who are completely atheists. Absolutely completely atheists. I mean, it's almost a caricature to have a Boo Jew, a Buddhist Jew, because it doesn't matter if you're born Jewish. I mean, converts to Judaism. First of all, we don't ever refer to them as converts because you don't remind an adopted child that they're adopted. If you've converted to Judaism, you're not a convert. You're a Jew. All right. But it's a very difficult process, and you got to be turned down twice. It's like getting a mortgage or something like that. You turn down twice before you're actually accepted and go through a very long process that's involved. My point is that there is a certain level, I believe, in large religious movements, even if they're broken down into smaller sects, that make it's a selling point. It's a selling point. Become part of this group because if the word in your explanation was beautiful, and Shane, and very compassionate and all that, but for a Jewish ear, the thing that sticks out, that's the word that sticks out, is the yet at the end of it.
Yeah, sure.
That as a Jew, I am quite happy not to believe in Jesus as divinity, as my savior and stuff. But I'm also quite happy. We've come full circle because I was here many years ago on that program with you and said, if you believe in something, the Jewish concept, if you believe in something that makes you more compassionate, that makes you more humane in your everyday actions, not internally, because I think it's nice, but what I care about is how you're walking through life. If whatever you believe in makes you more compassionate and humane, I will back you to the hilt in what you and support you in your belief. And I don't feel challenged by your belief whatsoever. And I have nothing to gain. If someone says, we really love Judaism, we want to convert, I said, you know what? We don't want you to convert because what we need is more people like you in Christian churches.
I'm going to, just for sake of time, I'm going to skip past question B to your last question, because I really want to get into this. And that's the Jonah story. This is something that Shane wanted to discuss with you, especially the remez, the allegory in Jonah 2. So Shane, do you want to just talk into that? And we've got around 10 minutes. So
we'll both
Yes.
speak quickly.
Yes.
Yeah, and I have no trouble with that. Just listening to you on Jonah would be perfect for me. But but to give you some context, so I started looking at some of Jesus's Sermon on the Mount and how it was grounded in some of the wisdom literature. So as an example, blessed are those that mourn, they'll be comforted. Well, let's go look at how you identify with the suffering of others in Lamentations. Hey, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Well, Jonah is called to go preach to obviously wicked people, like horrible people who invented the scaife, people who invented crucifixion. From my understanding, there's some Jewish histories around the Assyrians' treatments of people in Israel that were just abhorrent in every way. It would be like just somebody asking you to go to preach to your worst enemy. And Jonah, obviously, most people understand the basic story. He runs, but then and then he gets thrown overboard, and he's in this chaotic water. And when I started looking at it, I started noticing like all these remezes. Like as an example, and please forgive my Hebrew pronunciations. I don't speak Hebrew, so like he's at the bottom of the ocean, and he says, "You know what's really bothering me? The seaweed wrapped around my head." Right, and the word is suph, suf, I guess, which is the same word as Red Sea. You have a fish that changes gender. So the first time the fish is mentioned, it's a male fish. The second time, it's a female fish, and the third time, it's a male fish again. Then you have him spitting up on dry land, Yabasha, the same word as dry land in the creation story. And so what I started seeing was these remezes from Jonah's story to the creation story and to the Exodus story of the parting of the sea, walking across on dry land, new creation, fresh starts, second chances. The idea to me was, God's commitment to get out in front of our chaos, even when it's of our own making, and a commitment to engage things even to the point of death, to make a new creation. Even like the 3-day journey, Remez, my understanding is there was a book that predated all of this called The Descent of Inanna. And in The Descent of Inanna, her sister gets trapped in the realm of the dead, and so she goes to rescue her sister, and it's a 3-day journey to take on death. And if you come back in 3 days, you've won. If you haven't, you haven't. And so in one sense, it could be literally 3 days. In another sense, it could be a metaphor for an encounter with death. And so I started thinking about how committed God is to not just Jonah's story, but to my chaotic story. And if I will surrender my chaos to God, that God is willing to involve himself in my story to make a Yabashah, a new creation, a fresh start, a second chance, an opportunity to write a better story.
It's interesting because we're talking about Jonah, right?
Yes,
All
sir.
right.
Yeah.
Because interpretations are very tricky, and they're fascinating, and we actually should do a longer kind of dialogue about this. But however, interestingly enough, Jonah is the story that we tell during Yom Kippur. One of the stories we tell during Yom Kippur, our holiest day. And part of it is that Jonah indeed gets in a dream. God comes to Jonah and says, go to Nineveh. There are people who have basically lost their way. It's not a big deal. I mean, it's not, they don't go, there's not like a fire and brimstone. Their wickedness isn't really focused on. The fact is that they're not Jewish. They're not Hebraic. This one message. God cares. This is the Hebrew scripture. God cares about teshuvah of a non-Jewish people. All right? So Jonah goes, buys a ticket to go somewhere else. All right? He is running, but the ship goes out there, and there's sunny. All of a sudden, tempest, rocky boat going down. Everyone on the boat, non-Jews, Jews alike, are trying to save the boat. They're throwing stuff over the side. Nothing's working, but they can't find Jonah. Where is Jonah? The common belief is that Jonah is hiding. He's not hiding. He's asleep in the bowels of the boat. Jonah's problem is he is indifferent to the suffering of others and to God's message. Not he's afraid, not he's running from. He's indifferent. He just doesn't want to be bothered. So eventually, they bring him up there. They draw lots to figure out who's to blame for this, right? Because someone's got to be to blame. He draws the short lot. He's to blame. He explains the situation. He says, please, throw me overboard, and you'll be saved. The sailors don't want to do that. They continue to try to sail to save the boat. It's not going to be safe. They throw Jonah over. Jonah gets swallowed by a fish. Thank you very much. It's not a whale. It's a fish that he gets swallowed by. The 3 days, it's a 3-hour tour, right? It's Gilligan's Island. He gets in the bow of the thing. He gets spit. Here's the hand of God in terms of a 3-day-old fish, gets spit on the beach just outside of where he's supposed to go. He goes in there, he goes into town, he preaches. Everyone in the town does teshuvah. Even the animals do teshuvah. The king does teshuvah. Everyone does teshuvah. They redeem themselves. They change how they're going to act. On the mountaintop, Jonah, am I going fast enough? The mountaintop, Jonah's sitting there, and is he happy about this? No, he's angry. And he tells God, I knew they were going to change. Why bother sending me here? And he's getting hot because he's in the hot sun on top of this mountain. God creates a nice tree, a nice bush for him to sit under, and he's calming, he's calming down, and he's cooling down. And all of a sudden, God takes a giant worm and creates the worm, and the worm eats the bush and gets hot again. And Jonah starts crying about the bush, right? He's crying about the bush, and God says, you are in grief over this bush that only lasted a few hours, and you did not have anything to do with its creation. You are grieving over this bush, but you would not grieve over the people of Nineveh, that great city. You would not grieve over them. And these people I created. So the lesson that and that's actually where it ends. It ends at like in the middle of a sentence, basically. And the lesson we take from that is that the great evil of how things that go wrong in society and how things don't get fixed, like Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel Peace Prize winner who survived the Holocaust, says, it isn't necessarily the evil people, it's the people who are indifferent to the injustices. Because Jonah, even a Nivi, even a prophet, was indifferent to God's word and the suffering of these people. So, it's a great story. And this is a story in the middle of people fasting, hard fast for 27 hours. No food, no water, no nothing. In the middle of Yom Kippur, thinking about the way we have transgressed as a community. All of a sudden, we get the story about not being indifferent to the transgressions.
Amazing. Shane, a few closing words, comments?
That's just brilliant. I wrote a sermon years ago called "Planter People" around that same idea that you can, if we spent 1/10 of the energy we care that we do caring about things that bring us temporary pleasure, as if we put 1/10 that energy into things God cares about. And that's just brilliant. Tal, thank you so much for spending the last hour with me and allowing me to tag along with it. It's flown by. I count it an honor to call you guys my friends, and thank you for letting me be a part.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for beaming in all the way from Queenstown, New Zealand. Sleep well. Thanks, Shane. Awesome. Thank you, Tal. I dare say we have quite a few questions that have come through, so we'll save all of those and I'll answer the ones that I can answer in the next few weeks, and others I will save for Tal and Shane next time they're on Tuesday Night Live. Thank you for joining me wherever you are, and those of you in the auditorium as well. This will be the 100th episode of Digging Deeper, which will be uploaded in just a few weeks' time. I think it's about 3 or 4 weeks, and I'll be back on my own with Tuesday Night Live next Tuesday. Good night and God bless you.